Welcome to Doctor on Call with your host, DocGriffon. The doctor will be with you momentarily. Our guest this evening is actor, poet, and member of the legendary comedy troupe Friesign Theater, David Ossman. Warning, Doctor on Call can expose you to elements including wisdom and insight, which are known to cause several bouts of entertainment. Currently, there is no evidence that supports the claims that this talk show may be sexually transmitted, but feel free to try if you so choose. DocGriffon, paging DocGriffon, you're needed in the OR stat.
And thank you very much, Nurse Aydin. Tonight is a very special show in the fact that last week we had run into someone with the exact same symptoms. Yet, there's a different case here. So I think it would basically, let's not go into sharing all the additional extraneous. Let's dive right into it, because I think this is a case that might even boggle some of you out there. So strap yourselves in, and please do welcome to the show, Mr. David Ossman.
Oh my gosh, that's a great intro, and thank you, Aydin. And that was a great intro too. I'm liking this already. This is the new blogger verse, or whatever it is that we're doing here. And doctor, you are definitely in. Let's go. Great.
Now, of course, when you're diagnosing patients, the first thing you want to do is get a little bit of background. And one of the things that I always am fascinated about is where the journey began. At your youngest memory, when were you motivated towards the field that you are now in, or that you made yourself to?
Let's start with my calling myself a poet. How far back did that go, and where did that come from? Because that's probably the first. I think my first writing influence, which was certainly good in a lot of ways, was Gilbert and Sullivan. I listened to all of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas. I had the texts. I remember when I was learning to type, I typed from the book. I retyped the text. So it fixed a lot of things in my brain. And I was probably in 7th grade. I was 13 or so when I wrote my first melodrama that kind of used the format or the form of Gilbert and Sullivan, ensembles, a tenor's song, the soprano. That was what I knew about drama at that point. And so I'm in junior high, and by the time I was in high school, I definitely self-identified as a poet, and was publishing poetry in the school newspaper. And I think probably E. E. Cummings, I'd have to put, but also completely different, Dylan Thomas, writers from the 20s, but also at my time, ones who had only recently passed through, as Dylan Thomas had. Never met him, but his comet trail lingered behind wherever he was. I'll tell you that. So, a long answer.
Well,
but
no, not at all. And the thing that I think should be pointed out, because most of our demographic has been the beneficiaries of the internet and being able to have anything available at the touch of a button. Basically, the electronic era has basically made everything incredibly convenient. And I think one of the things that fascinates me is, and I kind of grew up in the era as well, to where if there was something that you heard about, you legitimately had to go physically search it out. And that brings me to thinking, did they seem more like a quest to find this information? And did it feel more like you got to the mountaintop and there was enlightenment there once you opened the books?
Pre-Google. Yes, I bought or acquired all kinds of books that we called back in the day reference books, because I felt that either they were useful to me immediately or they might be someday, but they were reference. You had to have them. My sources up until, well, I mean, when I wrote the first of the, I've written two novels featuring my old Firesign character, George Tirebiter. The first one was the Ronald Reagan murder case, which takes place in 1945. And it's entirely a world of radio and of that kind of communication, where the only urgency is you get on the air on Sundays at 5 or Fridays at 6 or whatever time it is. Those forms I was listening to when I was even younger, you know. So I was all the time acquiring dramatic forms. The poetry came obviously from reading and then from listening to records, which is what I did from very early on, certainly junior high. I had a 45. I bet on 45s. Was I wrong? But, you know, so you had, you know, Beethoven's Fifth on, you know, on 8:45. And the thing would slip down, and the needle kept coming. The next one would come down. Bum, 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 bum. It was not as good as the LP, and I'm glad Columbia Records invented the LP, because I was definitely a fan of Columbia and what they did as a label, more so than RCA Victor. And that's like, and that was NBC and CBS. So where was ABC? There were 1,000 little labels, you know, and they were the ones that did comedy records, basically.
Well, and I kind of take that era and parallel it to today's era, where, you know, your 45s, your LPs, your vinyl in general were those specific channels that you could tune into. And you know, nowadays, like I was saying, everything's there at a touch of a button, but there's millions and millions of channels, as there were millions of different venues. You just had to figure out which 45. Well,
here's the thing. Here's the thing. There weren't millions and millions. In fact, there weren't millions and millions. You could buy the Schwann record catalog, and you could count on all the pages. You'd come up with a few thousand records. There certainly weren't millions and millions. Field.
I just meant for pressings.
Well, yes, but still. My question is, and I'll just throw this out there, if everything's available, then why don't people seem to know anything anymore?
Wow. I think
there's absolutely no historical sense out there whatever. There's no depth of history. It just doesn't exist. You know, and I mean, and I'm coming from an era where we were so engaged in what was happening in the news, in the media, which was radio and television. That was our creative basis. We worked from that all the time, you know, keeping constant files. I had newspaper clipping files. They would go into the radio show with me. Physical, actual, hard objects, you know, scrapbooks, and there are a lot of them now in the Library of Congress. So I'm glad I did that.
Well, and I think fandom pieced itself together because there was that unquenchable quest, regardless if it was some type of musician or if it was a writer. There was always that chase going on, and
sure.
And I think it was reliable to say that if there was something that you really enjoyed, that you were turning all your friends onto it, saying, hey, you got to check this out. And there's kind of a paper trail where there isn't now. You know, it is, you know, here's a link to something, and then it's forgotten. Whereas, you know, somebody gave you a piece of vinyl, somebody gave you a book. And
yeah, it simply isn't. It isn't memorable, and it's not the way that being and everybody's special. There are everybody's different. The whole thing. Okay. I always buy books that I want to read. I always have. I've gone through library after library. I can't tell you how many books I've bought and sold, you know, at swap meets or at bookstore. I mean, hundreds of volumes of books. And that's just the way I've always been. If I see a book I want, I'm excited. If I see a website Google, I'm going into the other room. You know what I mean? I mean, it's not my way of collecting information, and I'm happy to plug in, look things up. If I'm writing, which I've done a lot of, you know, where you have to look things up.
Oh, sure.
The last 3 or 4 years, that's really convenient. And I've pulled illustrations for books out, you know, and been able to track down the history of things that I'll tell you, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, they have an archive of photographs that's, if you want to go back into, you know, noir LA history, they got a picture of everything. Los Angeles Water and Power. Who knew? You know, so there are some adventures you can take on the web that are a spark creativity, because you say, "Oh, is that what that is? Is that what that looked like? There was a hill there, and it's not there anymore." Whatever, you know. I mean, I took home movies in the '70s, and my grandchildren now look at them and say, "Well, gee, there's no houses where the Hollywood Hills sign is." You know. I mean, everything changes, particularly in Los Angeles. So, and I've done 2 novels there, and lived there. It's a source of material. The Friesign Theater was an LA group, not San Francisco.
Well, and
you know,
and one of the amazing things is that Phil Proctor sent me his book, "Where's My Fortune Cookie?" I could not read it on the screen. I had to print it out. I had to physically have it in hand. Because I think you absorb things a lot better when you do have them in hand.
Well, yeah, it's just, and for me, it creates an archive. I'm able to look back literally on a shelf at all of my work from the time I started writing poetry through the last thing that, you know, that I wrote, or the last thing that was published, last book of poetry. I published my first when I graduated from high school, you know, self-published. And I'm expecting another one out anytime. The press is very slow, but it's not their fault. All handmade books take their time, you know? So, yeah. The Friesign, my partners always identified me as the poet of the group. Because I came to them with that. I came to them with poetry. Always, I read my poems and others on the radio. It was a part of communication. You know, it was part of our Dear Friends shows. A lot of my poetry was published on the radio for the very first time.
Well, and I find there's a fascination and a brilliance to audio theater, the theater of the mind. But I want to curve back in here just a moment because you were talking about self-publishing. You were talking about going through high school. What was the linchpin that had you going on to higher education? What were you searching for in college?
Well, I really didn't know. I came not from, Phil Proctor went to Yale, and Peter went to Yale, and I ended up 2 years at Pomona College, which was very academic in California. It was very academic, and it didn't suit me. I'd come out of high school with 5 periods of journalism and physics or something like that, because I was editor of the school newspaper.
Okay.
And it was a daily newspaper, so it was a daily job, and that was very, very good training for me. Whereas Porgy Tyrebiter went to Morse Science High, Samuel F.B. Morse Science High. I went to Manual Arts High. And Manual Arts was graced with half the printing for the LA school district. And so they had linotypes. I grew up with the clattery sound of linotypes. I set my own type from, I mean, it's the real thing. It's not like, hey, I've got this Word thing and this app, and I can do anything I want, and I can write in Leonardo's handwriting if I want to. See, I have an app that has his alphabet. I mean, come on. This was real hardcore, really dealing with hot metal stuff.
Yeah, there's a loss of romanticism. Because I loved it when we had to set type.
Yeah, it's a bygone era, and it's it is a creative act, and so I was totally engaged in those kinds of creative acts all the way through high school. When I got to Pomona, and why did I apply? Well, liberal arts college. It was in California. My parents had moved out of the country. They were both in India. So I was kind of on my own. I was completely on my own, actually. And so in the around the world story is that in order to visit them in India, I flew to India and then went around the world because India is on the other side. And that was a very educational trip for me. I was in London and saw a lot of really top level. We're talking Laurence Olivier and John Gielgud, top theater. Went to New York, saw a couple, 3, 4 plays there, and said, it's crazy. I'm not going to stay in California. I'm moving to the Big Apple. And so my roommate and I, one of my roommates, we moved to New York and settled in there and went to Columbia, and this was then acting school. Although I did have a poetry class at Columbia, which was very important. My teacher was a woman named Leonie Adams, not in any way a well-known writer, but she knew what was going on. And she turned me on to the Beat Poets. And I read that first issue of, or I guess it was the second issue of Evergreen Review. That was the San Francisco issue. These are all real objects, friends. These are things that you hold in your hand and put in your library. These are artifacts. That's what we call artifacts. And it was a real magazine. You could really hold it in your hand. It was very special to have because it was the only place you could read Howl at that particular point. So not too long after I had graduated from college and not become an actor, worked for a while for Newsweek magazine, then I turned up a job in radio and as an announcer. And when that radio station went public, it was very early on, and it was a pioneer FM station in the first place. FM was very few years old in 1959, very few. And in 1960, it went public as a member of the Pacifica group of stations. There were 3 then. And I asked the station manager, the program director, if I could do some interviews with poets there in New York City. And he said, yes, sounded like a good idea, because I was palling around with these people and going to readings and reading myself and being in the company of, first-rate writers. And so that started an interview series called The Sullen Art. This is all way before the Friesign Theater.
Well, but this is one of the things that I'm incredibly fascinated with, because with the Sullen Art, you were able to get into the culture. You were able to interview these touchstone people, and I've read a couple of them. They were kind of difficult to find, but I've read a couple of them, and it's a snapshot that cannot fade.
Well, now there is the whole thing. It's there was an early edition published by Corinth Books. I was really a part of, I was inside that. It was, as the Friesign Theater was inside, whatever you want to call it, the hippie movement, inside, outside. I was definitely inside. And the University of Toledo, Ohio, loving that Middle West, everybody. The university, yeah, really, I can tell you, Ed, the Middle West is, we've done so much out there. Anyway, the University of Toledo bought my original tape archive, and after many years of prodding them, they published an edition that is not all 50 of the interviews, but significantly more than 12, which is what the first book was. So it really covers that scene very thoroughly. And, the scholars of that period, really consider this to be a key book that, the interview with Allen Ginsberg was probably the first one, if not, it was certainly the second. We was on the verge of publishing the second, his second book, which was Kaddish, and Howl had been out for about 5 years, and everyone I interviewed, the focus was all on Allen. Everything. That's what it was about at that moment. Mm-hmm. So I was doing these recordings on a weekly basis from about the middle of 1960 to the middle of 1961. And then I moved to Los Angeles and went to work for the radio station in L.A. And there was no scene, so there was no hope of continuing the Sullen Art.
But I do not want to breeze past this in any way.
No, you don't have to.
Because it's very difficult nowadays for someone to be able to catalog or use words or interviews to take a paintbrush and make a for lack of a better term, but it's true and fitting, to make a historical document, because there are a lot of things about the 60s that are set in misconceptions or 2-minute sound bites, or you get the CNN here's the 60s kind of deal, but it doesn't flesh it out. It basically skips over the water like a mosquito. Basically you can see ripples, but you really don't understand what's going on beneath the water. And that's what I liked. Specifically, the one that still sticks in my mind is the Allen Ginsberg interview. Mm-hmm. And it was... Well,
that was the keystone moment of that moment in time. Right place, right time.
Yeah, I would not disagree. It's fascinating because people will. Yeah, I don't want to use the word, but people will basically overstate or over dramatize things. But the interviews themselves were, here's how it is. This is my black and white. And you don't really see a lot of that. And it's not, and to me, I honestly thought I was going to be reading counterculture press, but it was not that at all. It was basically, here's a slice of life. Here's the way that I see it. This is the way I think things are moving. And I find that to be incredibly critical, especially from those people that are in the middle of it, instead of today we're getting a lot of people on the outside who don't put in the effort and basically throw their opinions out. They're not into the mix, so to speak. And that's the thing that really struck me with the Soul and Art is here are people who are doing this. And this is what they were thinking at that time. Now, it could have gotten 20 years down the road and that opinion might have changed. But if you crystallize it at that point in time, it makes relevant sense.
Yes. Yes, indeed. And what always was important to me about this group of interviews, they were the first ones that I ever did. I was in my early 20s when I did these. And was that they had an historical importance as a body of work. That really this was a year's period of time. I had Denise Levertov, who was very helpful. She sent people my way who were in town. Paul Blackburn. Really, I was more associated with the Lower East Side poets, as they're called, than I was with the kind of uptown Museum of Modern Art writers. We read poetry at the what was it, the Five Spot? No, there was a lot of jazz at the Five Spot. It was a good scene in New York in 50s and in 1960, 61, and there was no scene at all in Los Angeles. So when I was on the radio then, I had to turn my attention to other kinds of radiophonic creation. So I had, before I met Peter and Phil, I had, really 4 really creative years in LA, creating all kinds of radio drama, music, record programs, collectors programs, documentaries, all kinds of stuff. It was really an opportunity to be as creative as you wanted to be, and we all had that. We all had that thrill. That was public radio back then.
And before we jump in and continue, I just want to make sure that everybody listening, if you do want to find out more about this, of course, look down in the descriptors. We do have some media sources for David. We have the Friesign Theater website, of course, the Mark Time Awards, and we'll definitely get to that as well as Otherworld Media. I find that fascinating as well. Also, my stuff is down there. If you guys like the show, if you want to put some support behind it, there are links down there. And, of course, our prescription for additional entertainment for people that I like in the electronic medium. But I'm thinking, I'm really consumed about how people make those choices and how they get from A to B to C. What was that big moment where you said, I'm going to go to the left coast? What was your rationale for it?
Oh, it was because for me, there was nothing happening in beautiful Southern California. Okay? I had had my chance to actually had gone to MGM, done an audition at MGM with my college, not classmate, but he was 2 years ahead of me, Richard Chamberlain. We both ended up with some other students at MGM. We had our screen tests. I did not get to play Dr. Kildare. And really, I think that summer of seeing Broadway and London theater, that was it. That's what I wanted to do at that level of doing. And I didn't want to study economics, and I didn't want to take a sociology class, and I didn't care about any of that, you know? And so what I cared about was learning how to do the other thing, which was performance and writing, because I never stopped writing.
Was there some type of magnetism that drew you back to radio?
Well, radio was always in my life as a listener, okay? Mm-hmm. And so when I was meticulous in a number of ways about radio. When I was a kid, we're talking junior high school time, I kept a card file of music that I liked. I'm talking about classical music. Mm-hmm. And I listened to a wide range of radio stations in LA, including the classical, KFAC, which was an all-classical station. I listened to rhythm and blues on great, South LA R&B channels. There was a lot to listen to. There was also How Much Is That Doggy in the Window, I mean, there was popular music you couldn't really avoid. But I absorbed a lot of radio theater, a lot of Lux radio theater, broadcasts of movies, a lot of episodic radio, and quote, always wanted to do that, but it really wasn't in my life until I got a phone call that said there's an opening for a summer replacement radio announcer on WBAI, and are you interested in auditioning? I said, radio announcer, listen, I've been studying up on this all my life, sure. And I've passed the audition, and was worked in as a summer replacement, which was just kept on by the station and to replace the next announcer who left and so forth. So that dominated my life throughout the 60s. Radio, right into that Friesign came from. We were on the radio. We had radio shows. It was like all the time. There were radio. I was on the radio throughout the 60s.
I hate to stop you here, but it seems like we're gaining a little bit of static from your end. It seems.
Maybe I'm too close to the mic.
Are the storms kicking up there?
I don't think so. I can't hear the wind. You still have it? Static.
Yeah, I am getting a little circle up at the top, so there might be some difficulty with connectivity. We're getting a little word from the chat that it seems there's a bit of reverb and roboting going on.
Roboting and reverb. Sorry, chatters.
Wait a minute. That actually sounded better. Awesome.
Well, here we are. I did move away from the mic. I thought I was getting a little too close to the mic.
Well, that's okay.
Being intimate with it. But that's basically the so Friesign was started on the radio. We really thought of ourselves as a radio, as radio performers that brought radio into the LP recorded era, which we did. And there was never a time when we were off the radio, kind of. I mean, promotionally, and there were always interviews, always. I now miss being on the radio because I don't have a regular radio show. I haven't had for, I don't know, since the early 2000s.
Well, and we'll definitely jump in and talk about your NPR work too. But as far as it goes, when the four of you got together for Firesign, and I'm always interested in group dynamics. What would you say that your tethering point, or that your contribution to being a linchpin to the troupe, what would you say that was?
Oh, well, there are a couple of things. I often thought I was the only sane one in the group. And they really needed not so much a linchpin, but a tent peg, you know.
Sure.
And we all knew very quickly what we could each do really well and or better than anybody else, you know. There were the shorthand for that is Phil Proctor could fall off a couch, and he would be magnificently funny in falling off a couch and attract attention to himself, and that you did that in Hollywood. That really worked, and so we all had these particular skills.
Well, he did mention that you were an excellent plotter.
Well, I was more more engaged in plotting overall than in gag writing. And Firesign didn't rely much on that. I would say Peter was a person who could not leave words alone. You'd write something and everybody would say, that's really it, and Peter would turn it on its head. Peter was really not a wordsmith so much as I don't know. He could really work with words. And we all had our word skills. Mine was to always have a sense of meter. Also to have a sense of character, which is very important to Proctor. Proctor, came in with character. Peter had no character at all, other than the radio program Peter Bergman guy, and nobody knew who that was, or that he was bald or anything. They knew nothing about him except he had this mesmerizing voice, and could make you think that anything he said was his. And he was really our leader. He was the guy, but he had no stage skills. He was magnificent on the radio when you're hidden behind the microphone, but we had to say, Pete, you have to look downstage. Where's that? Downstage, Pete. Down there, like toward the audience. Oh yeah, okay, that's groovy. And of course, Phil, both Phils were trained actors, as was I. And but they were really active. I mean, Proctor came to Firesign directly from theater, from summer stock, from national tours. Busy guy. Came from what could have been quite a successful stage acting career, really. I mean, because he was a singer. He could have gone back to New York and done musicals. Chose not to do any of that and ended up with us and exclusively with us for quite a while until he really had to go back and use his incredible vocal skills and make a little money, which was not happening with Firesign at that point.
So would you say that you were the one who helped to inject the flow of the poetry, the syncopation, the rhythm, the meter of how the skits came about?
I think that was important. Also, I was the typist, which made me the editor. So I could say, "Did you type that down, Dave?" No, it wasn't. You don't have it yet. In the writing stage, when the four of us were all of us in the same room writing, it was a certain amount of of one-upsmanship, of who's got the funny word, not just the laugh line. But it's complicated to write comedy, as everybody knows or suspects. It's a craft, and we were doing many things at the same time. We weren't writing the kind of standard gag lines. We were writing commercial parodies, but they were surreal. They weren't about real. They weren't parroting real things. They were parodying surreal things. A lot of unconventional areas, but yes, as the rhythm, the meter, and I always made sure. This is from the radio programs onward, and you can hear them. You can hear them on the Dear Friends collection in a piece like Coal, which is just an improv. There's this beautiful improv from books we have in front of us. That was broadcast poetry, and in the Doctor Memory, all of that with avocado, nahuatl, so forth. These were all of the albums have one or two really specifically, absolutely poetry moments, and or sections, pieces, from the beginning right through to the end. Once we learned how to make complicated mixes on Electrician, which was four-track tape, and you cut all of this with a razor blade, as maybe some of our listeners don't know. And this was all done when we moved from radio to records. We were at exactly the same place that the Beatles were when they made Sgt. Pepper, 4-track magnetic tape. And so you did everything kind of again and again, and you learned how to make these mix downs that were really quite good. And as you get from the beginning to the end of that album, the production gets more and more interesting as we're learning how to do it, And the next album, we were trying to reproduce old radio with Nick Danger. This was our homage to what we knew about old radio, to the actors and the script writing and the strangeness of it all. And then just blew it up, talking to the sound effects man, and breaking the fourth wall.
Well, and here's the amazing thing. Firesign was active mid-'60s to, I would, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the real touchstone point was the mid-'60s to the mid-'70s. And people around this time, this era, the type of comedy that they were used to were, people like Jack Lemmon and Jerry Lewis, even a little bit of Mel Brooks with the Your Show of Shows, but you guys were delving into a foray because, of course, people like Lenny Bruce and Richard Pryor had not struck hard yet. They had not actually found their essence or their characters. How did the audience receive your definitively surrealistic takes on the topics and the pieces that you performed?
Well, in terms of record, there were kind of three levels of performance, really. The first was what we did on the radio when we were together for the very first time, which was the Oz Film Festival. We showed movies on the radio, and each of us played, not except for Peter, who was the host, the other three of us played two different filmmakers a piece, using various accents, as you can imagine. And at one point, Phil Austin is showing a film of his that is progressively being revealed to be pornographic. And Peter says, well, we have to shut that down. This is public radio. We can't do it. We have subscribers. They'll be offended. And so we shut the projector down. Now, this is all in your head, okay? So the phone immediately starts ringing. Well, you can't do that. You can't censor this guy's movie. People were outraged. And we looked at each other and said, they'll believe anything we say. And so, a career was born at that moment, that was October 1966. But really the first album was released early in 68. And we had our first East Coast tour, college tour in 1970. And I think we were probably at the top of that early period in 74, 75.
And what was the importance to you personally being able to perform live?
You mean to do well? That's what we did. I mean, the radio was live, so that was a given.
Oh no, I mean in front of an audience.
In front of I mean that. I'm moving up to that. Yes, okay. In front of an audience. Well, we were a rock and roll act. And given that fact, that meant when you released a record, you had to go out on the road and promote it. That's what everybody in our business, which was rock and roll, that's what we all did. So we opened at the Pasadena, what was it called? Opened at a club in Pasadena. And you've probably heard that story already. But we ended up in folk clubs because there were no comedy clubs. Folk and the Ash Grove was finally our home in Los Angeles, and we were there to promote the sales of our albums. That was why we went back on the road instead of hiding behind the radio. And we didn't do our recorded pieces. We fundamentally adapted several of our radio shows to the stage. So we were doing little plays. We weren't really doing sketches as such. I mean, there were sketches in our act, but the essence of the act was The Giant Rat of Sumatra, which was a takeoff on Sherlock Holmes, or famously Profiles in Barbecue Sauce, which was a very pointed satire of the political scene in which LBJ was conclusively proven the murderer of President Kennedy, and then Robert Kennedy was killed. And so we had to take that out of our act. I mean, we were very political at the beginning, very, very overtly political in what we were doing on stage. And we did benefits for people. We did Indian music concerts. And finally, you just got into this. You were being promoted. We had a management. We did not go on the road with the Beach Boys, which was probably a good idea.
And I just want to let the chat know in a few minutes we're going to start the Q&A. So
good. Okay.
Please feel free and go ahead and load your questions into the chat. But and of course I have to bring Nursey back on for the chat as well, because I know she's chomping at the bit. I know she's got a few questions.
I hope so.
Now, if we're breaking it down, because Friesign Theater broke up, resurrected. Between those times, and I got this same feeling from Phil when we talked last week, that there really wasn't any downtime, that everything that was done before was just foundational to push you forward to do other things, and do other things in a creative manner. So when you got to the end of the first run, what were you thinking? Where did you want to go? What was fueling your creative juices at that point?
Well, good. What happened to the Friesign Theater was that after 9 consecutive years of having our contract with Columbia Records picked up, it was not on the 10th year, and which meant that the career format that we had, which was a record a year, a promotional tour, and moving on into the film business, was not going to happen. So, and that was in 1975, after a career that wasn't as profitable for Columbia Records as, I don't know, Chicago. So, the band, I mean. Mm-hmm. So that was a real crisis of what do you do next. Before that, there had been the breakup of Procter and Bergman, and they're going on the road as a duo comedy act, was obviously very troublesome to Columbia Records, although this was the period of everybody having their solo album. So indeed, Phil Austin and I got our solo albums, which were very, very good. All 3 of them were. And certainly dealing in the same complex world of recorded comedy story, whatever you want to call it, that we all were at in 73, 74. But then after a really solid return with Everything You Know Is Wrong, an album that didn't confuse people. It wasn't The Giant Rat of Sumatra, which was an homage to the Goon Show, and nobody really got that. Some people, it's still their favorite album. I mean, there's an exploding dog in it, can't be bad. But so then we as a group faced the no record in our future, and Phil Austin was not about to let that one go. And he really got us the next couple of minor record gigs that we had, which did introduce us to Rhino, and Rhino became our once and future record label. Wonderful people at Rhino. So as a professional in one's 40s in Hollywood, yes, the question is what do? You try to keep your career going, and so there's a bridge of time before we came back as a group, which was in 1979, and this is, and I'll put in a couple of pitches here. My book, The Fighting Clowns of Hollywood, is a memoir of that time with a lot of scripts from the shows that we did, the live shows that we did. And concurrent, very soon to be released, and you'll find out about it on FriesignTheater.com, is a 7-hour and 1 minute compilation of all of the material from that period of time, which essentially is 3 albums. Joey's House, Fighting Clowns, and A Lawyer's Hospital, that we didn't really get to make as albums. We were on stage doing huge shows at the Roxy, big rock and roll venue on the Sunset Strip, lots of lights, huge sound system, in full view of everybody. Fighting Clowns was called a full frontal review, as a matter of fact. So nice. There was really, really a lot of work that went into that. Read my book, because it does tell of the adventure through that period of time, which ended up with not one single thing, not one of the totally hysterical television ideas that we'd come up with and performed. No one wanted. We did that kind of thing wasn't happening on Broadway. It was what was happening. Cheech and Chong and Saturday Night Live, and
Well, sure.
That was so to try, so nothing worked is what I'm saying. The story of that period of time is everything that these expert comedy writers wrote, 2, 3, 4 movies, I mean, endless stuff. None of it paid off. None of it sold. And so we as individuals had to figure out what to do next. And I went to National Public Radio and back to radio because I was wanted. Whereas in Hollywood, I'm not talking about the group. The group always needed one another, but I had to go and do something else where my skills were useful and were being paid for. I mean, I was in my mid-40s.
Well, and that's certainly understandable because, sometimes even something that you love a lot has got to take a back seat to the real life. I've got to make a paycheck. But in that time, were you still able to make a paycheck and feel you were being creative enough to satisfy yourself?
Well, by going to NPR, yes. There were a couple of years in the wilderness, and I think this is the Hollywood life. I moved out of Hollywood really after a decade there of the 60s. I've moved out in the 70s and have only gone back to work, and by that I mean gone back endlessly to work because that's where you work. But no, when there nothing came through out of those shows, I was totally creatively satisfied by the show I was doing, which was a 5-hour Sunday afternoon arts magazine show, which I was the host of. It looked like it had great promise in the future, and I figured, oh boy, I'll do this for a couple of years. There's a book in it. There's all kinds of, NPR. But this was the mid-'80s, which was or early '80s, really, which was a different time in NPR history. That was another thing, you see, being in the right place at the right time. The Firesign had the good fortune of being a rock and roll act. They didn't know that we were that, and they didn't care, really, just so we were selling records. And very early on in public radio, both before and after Firesign, and it was, there were, you as a professional, and by this time I'm not calling myself a poet, I'm calling myself a writer and producer, okay? Mm-hmm. So you adjust your own personal credits, and you keep making up your vitas and and sending them around. I'm going to cough, excuse me.
Not a problem.
Okay, Q&A?
I believe we should do some Q&A. And I would like to invite Nurse Aydin back on.
Oh, please.
If she can get here. I'm trying to figure out. Yeah, because we are running Skype, so I'm still trying to figure out. Yeah, she's got the ability to just jump right back in. And okay. If she doesn't, I'm sure she's going to send me a DM telling me I'm an idiot. But let's go ahead and start with the first question. John Doe asks, do you think the sea of artists all scrambling to present their plumage for narcissistic returns has hurt the industry or helped the industry?
Let's start with that flock of what? Right from the beginning. Do it again. Tell me again.
Okay.
It's a good question.
Do you think the sea of artists all scrambling to present their plumage for narcissistic returns has hurt the industry or helped the industry?
Well, if by the industry you mean Hollywood as an industry, it's hopelessly narcissistic. It's hopelessly only interested in itself. I'm glad that there are the opportunity for so many people to make movies is out there and available. It's still not easy to get a job, to get paid, or anything else in the industry, which is kind of a bogus term. But yes, it's way more open than it used to be, and certainly the internet, the blogosphere, all of that, which is it makes a lot of people available to a lot of people. But I don't know, here's a guy in the New York Times, and it's his life that's online, and gee, he runs out of money. He asks for some money, and people send him dollars, and I don't know. Is that creative? I'd say no. And is it narcissistic? Yes, I'd say yes.
And let's go ahead and flip that question on its head. Do you see anybody currently right now, not necessarily just in the Hollywood system, but in comedy, that's looking to expand, improve, expound, make it a better art form, to be able to stretch the medium, to make it something more vibrant and more creative?
Big question. And there are a lot of media there, that this is going on in comedy in particular. Situation comedy as such, I've never been very interested in as a form. I've never, particularly wanted to write that kind of comedy. I really think of the Firesign and of myself more as playwrights, and I'm more interested in reading about theater than I am about the next Spider-Man movie, Mm-hmm. And there's what's coming out now, and it's coming out in movies, and it's coming out in Broadway and off-Broadway plays, is a lot of hurt. A lot of hurt is getting out there, and a lot of broken lives are being explored and revealed. And it's not the wonderland of South Pacific and Oklahoma. You know what I'm saying? It's a much darker world, and it's going to an audience that may not be ready for it. I don't know, but that's how I feel generally about theater and film. That there's much more access than there was, but you are still totally on your own.
And does the same principle apply in current comedy?
Well, current comedy is based on our current government. I mean, honestly, is there any other comedy besides Trump comedy? I mean, that's what Saturday Night Live is about. That's what all of the late night talk show guys, that's what it's all about. It's people who are being nostalgic for Nixon. Yeah, I can join that, because Nixon was easy to make fun of, and we spent several years doing it too. But no, as I say, this is not the theatrical comedy that I'm interested in. It's think about, we were talking about the Goon Show earlier, the great British Goon Show of the 1950s, mm-hmm. which I heard at the very end of the 50s, and all Peter and both Phils were very well acquainted with the Goon Show, and Peter had worked with Spike Milligan just before he came to L.A. and worked with us. So
really,
yes, he'd come from a colloquium in Germany where he'd met Stoppard. And he was a part of this group. So he just come from Stoppard to Spike Milligan, and rolled into Los Angeles on a motorcycle and took over very rapidly. That was Pete. Amazing guy. I really miss him all the time, believe me. So if you're in just the short concluding answer is, if you have a career and you're an artist, then you're bringing in a paycheck by doing art, which means you have to figure out what art it is you want to do and how mundane that art can be. It certainly can be as mundane as, doing commercials, or it can be as wonderful as doing a voice for a Disney movie. I mean, you just have to keep working at it and persisting. And that's what, it's really in a 60-year career, I'm still doing it. I'm still promoting, what I'm doing next.
Well, and I'm not trying to paint your characterization, but there seems to be a general disappointment in your voice when you talk about the current state of comedy.
I think that it's basically political, and it is currently it it's a way of publicly making fun of this government, this absurdity that we're living through now. I mean, at least comedy, the television comedy, is largely in charge of making fun of Trump and the administration and all the stupidities and all of that. And I must say, that's the job. That's a good job. But I don't see that we are doing, the kind of, it isn't even the Johnny Carson era of television comedy. It is so rotten with celebrities. Oh, hi. I have someone else on my screen here that's very good.
That is Aydin. She's got her camera on.
There she is. She's got her camera on. So is it discouraging? Well, it's not just the shape of comedy. I mean, it's very mundane. It's very, it's a lot of people with one name, or their names have letters and numbers in them. I don't know. I don't care. I really don't. I have had a very full life. I'm still working real hard. I know what it is that I like. And I think that all of you must learn that after a certain point, you just stop taking in. I'd say about 75 years old is a good place to, stop intaking.
Well, and by the way, happy birthday. I know you celebrated your birthday last week. And wow, to see someone that is still so lively, so focused, doing so many different things. And aren't you currently involved in doing a play right now?
Well, what I did for my birthday at the local winery, which has a cabaret in the little village of Langley here on Whidbey Island, did a piece for my birthday. We've been doing cabaret there for 5 or 6 years. Every few months. And we have a group of performers, poets, writers, singers, musicians, and we put together kind of thematic shows. And this is a room that seats 40, so it's a great house. It's really a super house to play in.
Very intimate.
And so, yeah. I mean, it's like it's like half the size of a jazz club, like 75 seats. You're in an intimate environment. This is even smaller, but it's a small town. Anyway, did a piece called the Old Cart Wranglers Saga, which is it's about a 45-minute monologue with music behind it that was written for me by a guy named Brian Price, who's from the Midwest, and Brian seized on this wonderful character of a guy who is in his he's getting to be old, and he's run out of money, and so he wants to go to work. He has to go to work for the Mart, and they want him to work inside. He can't stand that, so he becomes a cart wrangler for the Mart. Okay. And it's a really wonderful story, and it's half a show. It's 45 minutes set. So Judith and I, my wife Judith and I, have been working on a show, because I'm booked for a show at the end of March in Squim, which is an even smaller community out on the Olympic Peninsula, even smaller than Langley. So we're kind of working up a show, and then and we will take this probably on the road. The last tour. No, you got to keep working. Honestly, you have to keep working, and very few people in the comic world of show business who have an act ever give up doing that act. Well, I mean, there are those of us who, it's like Ed Asner. Ed's going to work forever. There are people who just will go on working as long as they can stand up.
And if by some chance or happenstance that actually ends up on video somewhere, I'll be the first in line if you would like to link me to that video so I can watch it. Because I'm very intrigued by that. I love people taking mundane circumstances and making them valuable. And that's kind of tough because, you see a lot of comedy out there. You see a lot of drama out there where they have to put in, vampires or robots, and they miss the common subtlety of the humor that happens in everyday life.
That's exactly what's good about this piece. And it works on he's a really good writer, and there's he just talks about walking, and it's just the audience loved it, I have to say. That's why we're trying all of this out. Are they going to like it? Is it going to work? Or do we need a music? When do we, all that. So I think the other half of the show will be basically me and film clips from the Firesign's extraordinary video history. People think of us as records, but there are, if you add up the amount of hours on records that we did, what's it going to come to? 12, maybe? The hours of radio, early radio alone, there's 80 hours in the 70s, let alone all of that, the 24 hours that we did for XM radio. And there's just huge of it. And that's also what I'm doing at the moment, is trying to collect all of our work. So there's as Peter and I used to joke about, the 5-foot shelf. There's all of our work collected. That's my job. Proctor's not going to do this. He's going to write introductions, find pictures, but he's going to rely on me for the date book. And that's great, because that's the way we've always relied on one another for what we do best.
Well, and I honestly think there's a time for Firesign Theater's renaissance coming. I do believe that, because I'll just come out and say it. Comedy right now is flat. It's stale. It tries to be grander than it actually is, and in that way, they fall to the theory that if you have more flash and bang, it makes a better show. And it certainly does not when it comes to comedy. Comedy has to be inherently funny. You cannot take a 2-second premise and push it for 10 minutes in a skit.
No, push it for a 2-hour movie. Jeez.
Yeah.
True. Oh, whoops. I realized my mic was turned off. I had a really quick addendum. Yeah, sorry. I realized my mic was turned off. We actually do have theories for this doc. It's something I kind of wanted to ask, is that when you were talking about how politics, how comedy is inherently political today, something that basically has been posited by one of my advisors, actually, and one of my professors, was that comedy essentially needs to be a violation of what you expect. So when whatever you're doing becomes expected, so making fun of Trump or whatever, if that's the norm, then it no longer is funny. What is so interesting, I think, about a lot of stuff that you guys did in Firesign is that it was so, it is even now so unexpected when you listen to it. It's like, what? And you have to think about it a lot, and I think the processing is part of that. So I guess my question to you would be, in terms of all of this, do you think that what gets at something also, in addition to Doc's question, that's important or relevant to society, is that it has to violate what we expect?
Well, yes. But it does this in various ways. Obviously, with the gag is going to be something we don't expect. That's the punchline, okay? And gag writing expands itself into sketch writing. And what's dreary about Saturday Night Live and dreary about sketch writing is that the people are, quote, real, unquote, real. I'm not interested in. You have to force the reality of the character. Our president was, yes, it was Richard Nixon, had that voice, but I mean, the voice was that of the central computer of the world of the future, which all you have to do is unplug it. There's a lesson inherent in this that's bigger than making fun of some of whatever happened at the White House today. And believe me, they're going to make fun of it. But it's like a sitcom anyway. Who cares after a certain point? What's good is to make the big lessons, to make the big point. We started out by saying, don't take this period of time that you're living through seriously. That's what Waiting for the Electrician is all about on side one. Learn some history. Learn what's gone down, man. Wake up, man. And then, and then experience a trip, which you're not going to get anyplace else, because nobody else is tripping you except the Grateful Dead, except music. And so we started knowing that if we were being played on the phonograph, that people would listen to us in their own time. They could play us back again, which was better than old-time radio, you see, of course, which you only heard once, and then it was supposed to disappear forever. You could hear us over and over. You could hear us in your home. You could hear us as loud and in earphones as you wanted, which was the 70s experience, and you could lie on the couch and look at home movies projected on posters of rock stars. You could, it was yours. And we knew when we started writing who our audience was, but we had things we needed to tell them. And as late as Everything You Know Is Wrong and In the Next World You're on Your Own, our titles were relevant, were revealing what our thematic material was. It's not like we never wanted these records to go dead. Never.
Well,
I think they're more relevant today than ever. And many of the things that are in even The Electrician, Waiting for the Electrician, and in Everything You Know Is Wrong. I mean, it's Alex Jones is Everything You Know Is Wrong. He's the, that's the character you're playing essentially. That's in that album, and I think that so much of it, the she's not groovy totalitarian bit. I think that's in Dwarf. Or is that? Oh,
that's Electrician, yeah.
It's Electrician, yeah. Electrician, you mentioned that earlier, though, is that your earlier work was very political. And I have some of the written work that's on the website. And by the way, as you've been mentioning, everybody should also check that out. On the website, you can get pretty much all of the written, typed out versions of a lot of the early work. and also
we
DVDs and CDs.
do have the link for the Friesign Theater down in
right.
the descriptors. So, yeah.
Let's
make sure to encourage that.
Yeah.
We felt it was really important to print the scripts, and this goes all the way back to the 70s, because people were misquoting us for one thing, and so we wanted to get all of that straight. So those first two books came from Rolling Stone, came from the Rolling Stone Press, and it was really useful for people to have the script in front of them when they listen to the albums. Now it's more, I guess, artifactual. But almost everything will be in print. The last two books that I'm editing are coming out, which is the screenplay book, which was our unmade screenplays. They talk about way out comedy, and the other one is the last albums that we did for Rhino at the turn of the century. Where we finally got some Grammy nominations, which was nice. And those three albums, that trio of albums, very much like the early trio from Columbia Records, they're just beautifully produced and performed, and really filled full of real characters, real people, real stuff, real surreal stuff. And that for me goes way beyond comedy, and it's more like poetry.
Well, and if I may share just a personal story, I did competitive speech when I was in my high school years. And one of the things that I kept searching out, this was in the early 80s, was a screenplay or a copy of Nick Danger Third Eye. I wanted to do that as one of my humorous cuts, and could not find it at all. So I ended up settling on doing a cut from the Goon Show. But I always felt like I missed an opportunity to be able to expose people, because in my personal opinion, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, but I do not think surrealist comedy becomes anachronistic.
Oh, no, not at all. Remember that we had a whole political party, the Natural Surrealist Party, the slogan of which was "Not insane." And I must say, I think genuinely, in terms of you're really writing a history of the Friesign Theater, we genuinely considered ourselves to be inheritors of surrealism, of that movement. Not so much particularly André Breton or the French people, but more of the spirit of the kind of magical realism, the dream-like, the automatic writing, which for us was improv. I mean, same thing. All of these things seemed much more akin to surrealism than, say, to Arthur Miller. And
I mean, I think the critical thing that kind of gets forgotten is there were very, very strong comedy groups out there. And I know Entertainment Weekly came out with their top 30 greatest comedy teams of all times. Listed in there in different order, of course. There was Goon Show, there was Friesign Theater, and there was Monty Python's Flying Circus. And I believe it was one passing the torch to the other, because there's a strong vein of surrealist comedy that I think personally we're missing right now in current day and age. I honestly cannot think of any groups out there.
Because we have a lot of reality television. Where's surreality television?
I would love surreality television.
Yeah, wouldn't it be nice, surreality television? No, it's the reality show has taken over pretty much the way media is. I mean, not to disparage this or put anyone down, but constantly keeping track of your life and sending pictures of it to everybody you know is an absolutely useless way to spend your time. So I'm just saying that really nobody cares. If you put your life together and make a work of art and say something and communicate some real thing to some real people, that's ultra groovy. But if you're just taking pictures of yourself lying around and asking for money, and I'm talking, this guy is in the New York Times today, I'm not making him up. I mean, that to me is like wreckage, you know? And it's perfect. It's perfect because it goes with the rest of the non-surreal reality that we're living through, which is so surreal that you can hardly get a hold of it. I mean, how could Fires make fun of this? I don't know.
In so many ways, sorry, Doug. I'm basically a political commentator and social scientist person. But I use so many of the clips from Firesign because I think that something about the surreality, even from things that are 30 or 40 years old, they get at the core of actual reality by deconstructing it.
Well, it takes it takes an incredibly warped lens, and when you look through it, everything straightens up. That's how surrealism works.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. That's right. If you look at those Dali paintings, through the right lens, why that dripping watch goes right back into a nice circle. It makes perfect sense. We're much closer to the show that we did in the fighting show was essentially the three-penny opera. We were essentially doing Brecht. We had just done it much before.
I hate to cut you off, but real quick, we're getting that reverb and that robot.
I'm too close to the mic, being too enthusiastic, I suppose. Anyway, we come much from that kind of playwriting background. So Tom Stoppard, as I say, Peter just comes from a literary colloquium with Tom Stoppard, and he appeared very shortly after we came out. Suddenly there was this wonderful new playwright whom we can actually identify.
We're getting that roboting and that distortion again. So let's hope we can get the mics to reset on here. I tell you what, let me go ahead and ask. There's questions in the chat.
Sure.
If you could pass bits of information to younger folks trying to get their start that you may have missed when you got started, what would that be? So basically, to encapsulate life lessons that you learned on your way, that would help others out there who are, trying to do what you. And I'll be honest with you, we haven't even covered a quarter of what David has done. But in the context of what we've been talking about, I guess we'd have to phrase it that way.
Well, how's that beating and thumping now? Better?
Yes.
Okay. I think the helpful hints to people who are entering any sort of media career, things are very different now. So I can only say that you have to identify what your skills are, and as many of them as possible is really helpful. What your skills are, and you have to learn how to sell them and really how to put a price on them. In this day, you are, this is the next world. You're on your own. You really have to sell yourself in any of these businesses. And as they used to say, it's who you know. That is still true. You have to be very focused, and it is good to say that you are something else besides. It's very good for me to have said I'm a writer, because that keeps me grounded. If I said I'm an actor, I'd be looking for my next acting job, and writing jobs are easier to come by. There were, even in Hollywood, they were easier to come by, and now you write your own novel, get it published. I mean, it's made into a television show, and you're a billionaire in 20 minutes. I mean, you have to will yourself to do this. We do that. Judith and I have been working together for 30 years, over 30 years, producing giant radio shows, star-filled vehicles, costly programs by radio standards. And when 2008 and the Depression of 2008 came, we lost every job in the arts that we had. They were gone because suddenly there was no money for the arts. You follow? So you better have a plan B, You better have a plan B.
Well,
which can still be writing. You can still be writing your novel. It can still be, but maybe you have to go to work for the post office. I don't know.
Well, and one of the things that I talk about on every show ad nauseum, it's one of my gimmicks, so to speak. I always talk about you have to flex your PEC, which PEC is an acronym for passion, effort, and commitment. You have to be passionate for what you do. You have to make the effort to actually do it, and you have to be committed to see it all the way through. Because if you fail in any one of these three things, then you fail in any feeling of accomplishment, any aspect of being able to find, if nothing else, self-satisfaction in the things that you've done. Even if something crashes and burns, you can walk away if you have flexed your PEC, if you have put in the passion, in the effort, and the commitment to see that it's done. Even if it fails, you can still take pride in the fact in saying, I did the best that I could, and you know what? The next time, it's going to be better. I've learned, and I'm going to put just as much pride, just as much effort into it, and things will get done. I do want to make sure, because I know. And please tell Judith that we said hi.
Oh, she just walked into the room. So here she's looking at her watch saying, when are we going to have dinner? And I said, well.
Yeah, we only have a little bit of time left. And
only a bit.
We certainly appreciate the time you spent with us.
You're exactly right, Doctor. You're exactly right about PEC. That you need that. I guess you need that in most any you need it in, I think, in anything that you do, and following through and finishing. If you don't finish it, you're never going to look at it and say, it's always going to be something you regret, or that is still broken, or finishing is really important.
Yeah, you cannot regret something that you've put 100% effort into.
I mean, we've had these huge jobs that have failed. We had a commission in probably 1997 from someone who wanted us to come up with one of these 3-minute radio programs that was a break between one kind of show and another, drops between day parts.
Okay.
And this would be coming up for the millennium. This would be every day we'd be advancing a year or a decade or whatever it was, like 1,000 radio programs, starting in the year 1000. And I actually came up with, and we both found producers for, a huge number of these just to get them off the ground. You know, this vast idea. No one was going to broadcast this, but, you know, the guy commissioned us to do it. We figured it out. I figured it would never, ever happen because it was going to cost a fortune to actually do this, you know. But you put all the effort into it and you're able to walk away from it and saying, well, you know, if anybody wants 1,000 years of program ideas, it's in my drawer. And that's another thing about keep your work.
Oh.
Keep your work.
Yep.
My archive, my Friesign archive is now in the Library of Congress because I kept my work. I kept the papers. I kept the, you know.
Which is amazing. Kudos to that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's really, it proves that we contributed to American culture, and I couldn't be happier about that because America needs as much culture as it can get.
And I would like to give Aydin the opportunity because I know with Aydin, she never has just one question.
Usually. I asked Phil the same question, so I'll ask you. Something the leprechauns asked me back when I was a sprout in Indiana has always puzzled me. Why does the porridge bird lay his egg in the air?
Well, you asked that of Phil, right?
Yes.
And he gave you the real answer, didn't he?
I believe he did.
He did. He did. You know, this is one of those mystical things that comes out of the absolute blue. Where did George Tirebiter come from? Well, that was the name of USC's dog mascot. You know, we were hoarders. We were hoarders of language and words and funny stuff. And that quote was like basic to Proctor. This was just something that Phil brought in with it. And I think we just probably found a good place to use it, you know? We came, you know, with a lot of experience for how old we were. You know, when we actually started, I was the oldest at 30. Everybody else was in their late 20s. And we'd had pretty much a lot of experience amongst the four of us in the world and as writers or actors or creative people. And so we brought a lot to the Friesign, including our fantasy life, including our dreams, and our memories, you know, very important. Location. I know how we would always design the location of the place that we were producing for an album, you know, draw diagrams of what the set was like and where they act, just like blocking a play. Exactly.
Wow. So like how long ago we leave Goshen? It was actually all planned out, you know.
Well, Goshen, of course, that's another Proctor touchstone. Yeah.
That's so fascinating, though, to actually lay it out. But I think that my only actual question outside of that was, and it'll be the same thing I asked Phil as well, is that did you have any idea at the time that so many of the things you were talking about were going to be prophetic in so many ways? Or it could just be what we mentioned sort of before, that like it's cutting at something very basically human when you become a surrealist and you surpass realism. You're cutting into the core of it, or I don't know. What's your take on the prophetic nature?
I think both of those things are true. That we did try to, as you say, cut to the core. Well,
and if you can cite example, maybe the computer hacker.
Well, this is the thing. I think we occupy the same position, especially in that period of time, as futurists. Basically, if you had to categorize Friesign Theater, we were basically writing science fiction, basically, and a lot of what we did was in that futurist vein, you know, possible worlds and so forth. And so by calling up what, and we were reading books. I mean, we were educated young men. So, we were reading about what might happen. We were talking about on the radio about what might happen. And with bozos, just to kind of wrap this thought, the instinct to do something about with a central computer brain was self-evident. That was the medium that was unrolling literally in front of us. And we had previously done, a record that was essentially about records. And we'd done one that was essentially about radio, Nick Danger on one side and the American Pageant, which was kind of cribbed from Norman Corwin on the other side. And then we'd done film and television with Dwarf. And so when we were casting around for a medium to work with, Disneyland was kind of the way we went. Oh, what's the Disneyland kind of structure? What happens there? And that indeed became phantom visions produced by electronics that weren't so hard to predict. You know what I mean? And the fact that there would be this policeman, Deputy Dan, who'd just stay right there until we come in. That began to get a little scary. I mean, I think it was obvious to us what might happen, and that's 1971. So, and surely, yes, it was. Phil was indeed the first hacker ever in a piece of fiction that I know of, and all of that stuff was stolen by Disney anyway. So
what an interesting turnabout that you're parodying them, and then they come back and potentially take that and run with it.
But you see what I mean, that we because we were essentially futurists in the science fiction aspect of our writing, we were always, that's the other side of being way out there, in a surrealist sense. I mean, the whole world of the world of everything is wrong is so real. The desert, living in a caravan out on the desert in the middle of, and this is a part of the world we knew so well. It comes in a surrealistic package.
The song
is by what it looks like.
The song about America in that is so fantastic, and it's in so many ways. I can't use it actually on YouTube.
No, you can't,
because of some of the words in it. But
yeah, that's right. And we never, when we did that piece, the American Pageant, later on, we never did it that way, obviously. But that song on the album is called "The Policeman's Brawl." It's sung by two policemen, and we were pushing we were pushing it as hard as we could. That's America, buddy. We were pushing it as hard as we could. This was 1971. That the war was still going on. Vietnam, people were still getting drafted, kids were still getting killed. We were in the studio when all of these dreadful things happened. We were either on the radio or in the studio doing an album. I mean, all of 68, 69, 70, Kent State. All that stuff was going on where we were writing and producing. So obviously the work was reflecting what was going on in the real world. But as writers, we could explore what might happen as a result of this. My high school has disappeared. Well, how did that happen?
Oh, I was
the
about
Russians
to bring that up.
stole it.
I was actually about to bring up Porgy and Mudhead because all of that is about this facade of normalcy and the American dream sort of over like really weird things that are happening in this totalitarian environment that's all going on, behind the scenes. My favorite line in that actually has to be, "Gee, Dad, no Irishman can stop you from getting to be dog killer this time." It's just it's so
that's one of those innocent movie lines that you say, wait, what did he say? Yeah. That's the great teenage. Of course, we the three of us, the four of us, all grew up watching those movies or listening to those movies on the radio. Those teenage comedies. There were so many of them, and it's kind of the putting them. I've done it on stage. I've done it as a kind of flattened out the script and done it as a stage production here. And it really is interesting because the story becomes an old man who's retired. Here it's like me now, right? Old man. And he's watching himself on television. He's watching these two movies that he made. And in one, he's a kid getting, slapped around by his father. And he gets his high school stolen, and what's he going to do? It's the Cold War, And in the other one, not a sergeant, a lieutenant in the army, and it's Korea, but it's really Vietnam, and it's the world that we were living in that moment, as seen through the eyes of someone who had made it long before. So we're existing in so many levels of time here that I'm already lost.
But again, I think that's what makes it timeless. Because you can insert stuff into it, when it becomes so elaborate and surreal, again, that it transcends maybe reality, things that are very temporal. So like jokes that were very funny in 1995 about George Bush Sr.
Yes.
Are not very funny now because nobody really knows much about the political situation of that day.
Well, there's too much of a specificity to it.
Right. There's research on this, but which is like how I end every sentence I ever say. But we actually do have studies that show that comedy has the sweet spot of being relevant. But I think that actually when it's surreal, it doesn't necessarily have that sweet spot of relevance because other ideas can be inserted into it, which makes it essentially timeless. I think Monty Python also fits that. Some aspects of bits of National Lampoon.
Definitely Goon Show.
Goon Show, yeah. A lot of these things that aren't just satirizing a specific thing, but a concept. You satirize a concept, it's different from satirizing a thing, right?
Yeah, you don't have to put if you have to put on a big television show every week, then there's a lot of compromises you have to make and a lot of people you have to employ, and it changes all the time. And what happened, just to back up a little bit about comedy, what happened when comedy happened is it was a short staircase to television. People got into stand-up comedy at the beginning, not because they wanted to be stand-up comics. They wanted to be on a television comedy show. I mean, it was the way you got there. And then kind of stand-up comedy, stand-up became like a thing of its own that mostly had to do with self, mostly about me. And I'm going to talk to you about me. And I tell you, I just really had a bad life today, and I really had a bad, want to hear about my wife? I mean, I'm parroting that kind of thing. Or it became improv groups. It went that, but they're very structured improv. It isn't like, sitting around and just having a good time. They're very structured things. And I think that's the two places that comedy went, into the kind of comedy club things of this is all about myself, and I read this in the newspaper, or my brother-in-law, or it's about enacting these kinds of pieces that improv groups have worked up. My granddaughter does this, and she does it very well, and tours around with it, and but it's too structured a form for me, kind of. I'm a much looser, automatic writing guy, I guess.
And I know time is precious here, but there is one other thing that I did want to ask about. And
okay, one more. Well, you get one more, Doctor.
Thank you, sir. I'm fascinated by the Mark Time Awards.
Ah.
And I was wondering if you could go into that a little bit. I will say right up front, I've always had a fascination with theater of the mind. I've always appreciated stories that made me fill in the blanks. And yeah, as a kid, I did grow up around radio. And I found it infinitely more fascinating than when a movie or a television show was feeding me this, because I felt like I was more involved. I felt like I had a greater role in it because I was the person fleshing it out in my own mind to make the story have greater impact. And I read up on the Mark Time Awards, and I was amazed that you've put something together like this. Can you explain that for the audience?
Sure. About 20 years ago, a group of friends and we were listening to the current state of what we used to call radio drama, audio theater, and the great creative minds of this field were aging, and where was the new talent, and how was the new talent going to be going to learn their craft? And since 1980, we had done a workshop first in Missouri, in Columbia, Missouri first. And these were training people to produce live radio drama. It was very specific. It was live shows. And then Judith and I, early in our lives together, we did workshops on various techniques of audio theater production, live on the air, all kinds of different ways of approaching the art and craft. So we were always very engaged in this right from the beginning. So in our circle, we began talking about it seems to be losing momentum. What do we do about that? And so we came up with the Mark Time. There was originally only one, the Mark Time Award, which was to encourage people who were producing audio theater to really do their best, to really do really high quality, as high as possible, of audio production, the best actors and so forth, to award real quality. And to be able to do that on an international basis, because there's a lot of radio production everywhere in English. So this was about 21 years ago. And we named it because we felt that the main genre that we were getting was science fiction. So we named it after my Friesign Theater character, the Mark Time Award, and instituted that, and we started getting submissions, and over a long period of time, it became quite a nice brand. People liked having the award, they liked being honored, and we every year had at a science fiction convention in Minneapolis, we'd give out these awards publicly and do a half-hour live radio show at the same time. And that gradually became more and more popular, and we added other prizes, the Ogle Award for horror, because we seemed science fiction, we wanted horror fantasy, and an award for mystery, which was obviously the Nick Danger, and so forth. So it had expanded out until there were 5 or 6 prizes that we could offer. we felt then, as a couple of years ago, that this would be after, we'd really lost half of our members after Phil Austin died. We wanted to figure out what our legacy was going to be. And the Mark Time Awards were certainly one of these legacy projects, along with the complete works of the Firesign in one form or another. So that's what it is. It is open to submissions at the Mark Time Awards site. This year is an off year. We're planning on doing it in 2020. Would be the next celebration. We hope that anybody who is in the audio production business, this is not radio, this is audio, which means any sound-based medium that is concerned with being theater. This is, generally speaking, not fact-based, but fiction. If you understand what I mean, this is not this is not an award for This American Life. It's another kind of drama that we're looking for.
Well, and I certainly will after this show. There's a couple of audio adaptations that they've done of my stories, and I'm just going to send you one and hope you enjoy it.
That's cool.
Because I really do think that in order to get people to start thinking again, to adapt these things that were so beneficial to ourselves and our ancestors. And I really do think that the theater of the mind is something that is coming back. And I think that's something people crave, because I really do think that the population is kind of tired of being force-fed what they need to like, what they need to think. And it's a very rare commodity where you can have something presented to an audience and they will be able to become interactive with it. And it's not a video game.
Yeah. There's a lot of very good stuff out there. Great Northern Audio is the production company that's associated with the old Cart Wrangler, which is a great piece, and that's available on CD, maybe for download as well. There are still wonderful producers, more and more, and so keep checking it out. And Doctor, thank you for this. Nurse,
Thank you so much.
For the moments that I saw you, I was a little scared with the guns on the wall.
Oh, hey. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
I defend your right to defend your studio. I know.
And I will go ahead and do the closeout here. So if you all could sit back for just a minute. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out this evening. Of course, I do encourage everyone to go down, check out David's links. Not only is it there for the Firesign Theater, but for the Mark Time Awards, and we didn't even get to Otherworld Media. Hopefully somewhere down the road. I honestly think David's going to outlive me. But
well, you need Judith for that one.
But we do have a great December to remember. And I just want to make sure and let you know next week we're going to have digital artist Optic Decay up. And then, of course, for our Christmas special, a very special December 25th, we'll be having a YouTube commentator Lo-Fi, direct from Denmark. And we'll be talking to her about, a vast plethora of my ignorance. And I think everybody tuning into that will probably enjoy that a lot. So once again, thank you very much to David Ossman for spending his valuable time with us. We look forward to seeing what else you're going to be offering down the road. And of course, thank you, Nursey Aydin. And
of course. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And if we have to go into any type of diagnosis, I can say, just like I said last week, there is nothing wrong with the patient at all. And this, if anything else, should be an inspiration for those of you. If you think that it's just a common disease, then you certainly need to catch it. But for myself, DocGriffon, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. And, of course, the doctor's office is closed.